So welcome everyone. I am Barbara Fisher, Capital Grant Administrator at MHT. We are also joined today by Charlotte Lake, Capital Grant and Loan Program Administrator. Charlotte will be keeping an eye on the chat for me today, helping to answer questions throughout the webinar, and will also help provide links in the chat that I discussed throughout the webinar. Today you are attending the Historic Preservation Capital Grant Program Match Requirements Q&A webinar. This is the last webinar in a series of webinars we started in November. And even though you signed up for this webinar in order to apply for the Historic Preservation Capital Grant Program, those applicants, which is who this webinar is directed towards, we just want to make note that these match requirements that we're going over today are also the same for the African American Heritage Preservation Program grant. So they follow along for each program type. So you can find the slide decks to each webinar on our website noted here. Soon we will have links to our website to the recordings of some of the previous webinars we completed, including today's webinar. So hopefully by February 8th, we will have all of those recordings up on our website for you to view, which will be helpful for you in filling out the application. On our website, you'll also find various documents needed to complete this year's application. This includes the grant guidelines, which will help you fill out the online application, and which I will be talking about and referencing a lot today. The sample budget and instructions, the letter of property owner consent template, a sample of the fiscal year 21 application, and then also the quick start guide, which helps you with navigating the application portal on our website. Everything we go over today and more is outlined in our grant guidelines on the website, so I definitely recommend that you find those today after the webinar and review them. And then similar documents that I just talked about are available on the AAHPP grant website, which are specific to that program. So just to go over some grant basics, very briefly, in case you were just learning about this grant and you're not as familiar with it, I want to make sure we're all on the same page as to what this program covers. The HP Capital Grant Program is a very competitive grant program that focuses on urgent historic preservation projects which protect historic architectural features and that demonstrate a strong public benefit and educational component. This grant program only funds capital construction-related projects, as you can see here. The program is allocated $600,000 each year, which makes the program very competitive. And you can see here that we have a maximum grant amount allowed of $100,000 that you can request. And then we recommend a minimum of at least $10,000 for your grant request. So today's webinar is focused on the match requirements of the grant program. Every applicant entity, except for nonprofits, are required to provide match. So this includes business entities, individuals, and local and state governments. If you are a nonprofit and you're joining us on this webinar, you can leave now. Everything I say today is not related to you, or you're not required to provide match, so you don't need to know anything about the following information. So here are some general ideas to keep in mind when thinking about your match. First off, it's one-to-one match required for all those applicants that aren't nonprofits. This means if you're coming in for a $50,000 grant, you're required to provide a combination of cash match or in-kind match that also equals $50,000. The match must relate directly to the grant project, so it must relate directly to the construction project components itself. The match must be used within the grant period as outlined in the grant agreement, which is typically about a 2-year period. And you must also document the match in your application. And if you're awarded a grant, then you also have to provide that documentation when you request payments to be funded by the grant. So match can be any combination of cash and in-kind. Here are the most common examples of both. And in our guidelines is a more extensive list of each of these examples. But for cash sources for match, cash donations are very common, loan funds, and fundraiser collections. So any money you raise that you can put towards the project. Examples of in-kind sources include donated or discounted materials that you may receive from a local vendor or maybe someone in your community, donated volunteer services. You can use your volunteers at your organization as part of your in-kind match, and also staff salaries, which is kind of new for us, but we can talk more about how to document these later on. So when thinking about how to pay for your project and structure your budget, I want you to think about this list. These are the most common uses or examples of match to kind of help flesh out your project. So services when the grantee cannot hire through a competitive bid. So if you're awarded a grant with us, we have a strict procurement process that we have to go through in order for components of your project to be paid for through the grants. But if you have match that can maybe pay for a specific architect that you want, your match can pay for that architect, and that architect doesn't have to go, we don't have to go through a procurement process, for example, to hire an architect. You can go with the one that you want. Services provided by the property owner or grantee. So this includes things like materials or staff time, things that you can use as match to kind of help leverage your project. Specific construction supplies or equipment. If you need or want, a certain type of material or equipment for the project that you don't want to have to go through using grant funds for, you could do that. Construction permits, sometimes it's easier just to use your match to get the permits going and get those things started, because it can take a while sometimes to get grant payments, especially for reimbursements. And architectural work or assessment. So using your match, to pay for drawings maybe, or some sort of assessment you might need done on the building. These are all great examples of ways you can kind of help structure your budget by using your match. So other examples of match include, of eligible match include cash expenditures within the grant period and grant scope of work, the staff salaries for time spent on the grant project. So the staff would need to be tracking, what work they're doing specifically for the grant project. It can't be, other project related work. It has to be specific to the grant project. Donated discounted construction supplies that you might get from a local vendor or a volunteer or maybe someone else in your community. Services donated by a professional, like I was talking about before. Eligible match by maybe even an architect on your board. Their services can be used as match, or a contractor. Volunteer time spent on the grant project. So if you have volunteers or anyone has spent some volunteer time on the project, that can be used certainly as eligible match. I just want to note too, if you think you have eligible match that is not in our list in our guidelines, please feel free to reach out to me, and we can figure out if your match, would be considered eligible. These lists aren't exhaustive necessarily, but we've tried to do the best we can to include, what we know and what's worked or not worked in the past, and what most people have questions about. So starting to kind of get into a gray area of what's eligible and ineligible regarding an acquisition before we go more in depth about ineligible expenditures or ineligible match. If your project is an acquisition, match related to the acquisition may be eligible. So if grant funds will be used exclusively for acquisition, then other acquisition funds could be used for match. So for example, this isn't a very common one, but for example, if a property is appraised, for like $200,000 and then it's sold to a local government for about $100,000, that difference may be used as match. But this is specifically for your project if it's just specifically an acquisition project. Otherwise, the cost to acquire a property can't be used as match. So regarding ineligibility of match related to state funds or other state projects, other state funds, it's a big one as far as ineligibility that people might not be aware of, but state funds cannot be used as match. This includes things like bond bills or maybe other grants from our program or our agency or maybe another state agency. And it's also something to keep in mind. The same match can't be used for more than one state program. So if you have eligible match that you use for our grant, you're not able to use that for another state program funding source. But we do have a question in the application where you can discuss other state funds and other state grants that you might have. It's in our budget section, but please do not include anything about other state funds in your budget spreadsheet, which we'll go into a bit more detail in a few moments. So here's a brief list of examples of ineligible match. These are categories we get kind of the most questions about. But like I said before, there is a much more extensive list in our grant guidelines. I really hope that you look over when you're putting together your budget and thinking about your match. So things such as insurance on your property or appraisals on your property are not eligible. Landscaping costs, expenses for hosting meetings. This might be a surprise that you see it on the list, but we do get asked about this. We don't, those are ineligible expenditures and an eligible match for this. Maintenance on your building, hosting fundraisers is ineligible, but the money that you raise during the fundraiser is eligible match. General office expenses or operational costs are ineligible. Accounting and audit costs and property taxes are also an eligible match. So now we're going to talk more about how to document your match. It is required to show your match contributions in your application and after you are awarded a grant when it comes to payments. So for cash match documentation, documents such as a bank statement or official treasurer's reports are good examples. Letters from donors, we need to make sure it includes the amount that they're donating and please have it signed. Award letters for non-state grants, so other nonprofits that you might get grants from, those are eligible and you would need to document that. Loan commitment letters from a bank. And for a government entity specifically, you need to show your budget documents that clearly show the line items and that you're committing to as match. So you can highlight those, you can star those, you can circle those. Just need to make it clear that what on your line item amount you're using for match. And also you want to make sure to block out any financial ID numbers. You might be surprised some people forget to do this, or any other private information that are on these documents, especially on like bank statements. Keep in mind that these documents become a part of your file, even if you just submit an application and you aren't awarded. So we kind of keep those records indefinitely, essentially. So in-kind match documentation, how do you document in-kind? So it might be a little bit more effort into this than the cash, but here is a list of the most common uses of in-kind match and how we're going to document them. So we talked about staff salary briefly earlier. So you'll want to make a spreadsheet or something for staff members that are working directly on the grant project, and you'll need to indicate the amount of hours that they worked and the rate that they work per hour, and a very, very brief description of what they were doing as part of the grant, and signatures from those staff members are preferred as well on those documents. For volunteer time, you'll need to calculate the hours by using this independent sector website calculator. It has the Maryland rate. I think you can choose the Maryland rate when you go in there. All of these in-kind match documentations have to have a value related to them. So this is how, we help you figure that out. And just kind of briefly explain what the volunteer time was and what they did. We don't need to know their name or, all of their information, but just kind of what they did and, how many hours they spent. Donated services, we need a signed statement from the donor with the value of the services noted. Make sure it's signed, make sure it has the amount that they are donating. And this can be, like the architects or, contractor, if you have a tradesperson or someone who's donating their professional, kind of services, what's their rate? You want to make sure it's clear on that. And then for donated materials, a signed statement or receipt or invoice from the donor. And you want to make sure that it notes the fair market value of the materials or, and or the discounted rate that you got of the materials. So other project funds, this is a section on your budget spreadsheet that we'll look into shortly. I talked about other project funds a little bit when discussing, other state funds and how they can't be used as match. But here we want to make sure you know that if you have match that goes above and beyond what you are required to provide as match, so other project funds is what we call those, please put that in the other project funds answer in the application and in the other project funds column in the budget spreadsheet. So this is for anything extra beyond the match that you're required to provide. If you have anything, you can, please put that in your budget spreadsheet and include that in the application. And again, this is for non-state funds only. There is a separate answer and question where you can discuss what other state funds you do have, and we like to see that. It helps us just kind of understand your project in full, but that's not information you include in your spreadsheet. Also, you need to make sure to identify the source and amount of these funds in your application. So when you you answer that question about other project funds, that's where you want to talk about the source of those funds. And I just want to say, if you are a nonprofit and have made it this far into the webinar, that this is the column where you put any additional funds that you have going towards the project. Other than that, don't put anything in the match column. We will move it over to other project funds if you're a nonprofit. Otherwise, just stick with the other project funds column. So here's an example of the budget spreadsheet. You'll find this on our website, and it's an Excel file. It's downloadable, and then you can, make your own spreadsheet in it. Make sure not to include any of the information you see here that's, not related to your project. We just want to make sure we have everything that's related to your project. And so that means all the work items, briefly describe what they are. You have the column for the amount that you're requesting from the capital grant fund. And then you see there in kind of the middle in the light blue column is the applicant proposed cash and in-kind match column. So that's where you will include any of the match that that you'd like to use for the project, and you can specify where it's going with each line item on the spreadsheet. And then you see the other project funds column. So if you have anything beyond the match you're required to provide, and that's non-state funds, that's where you will enter that on the budget spreadsheet, and then it'll total it up for you at the end there. So kind of to wrap up here, the match requirements webinar, we wanted to let you know kind of how we will be viewing your match and how we will be considering if your match is eligible. And these are questions you can be asking yourself if you're trying to figure out if the match is eligible, or you can always email me and we can talk about match. Things that we think about though, is the cost eligible? Is the cost of what the match is eligible? Has it been used in the grant period as noted in the grant agreement? And is it related to the approved scope of work or budget, as noted in the grant agreement? Does it relate to, what the project is supposed to be, or is it unrelated and it's a different, it's a different project that you're working on? Is the cost necessary for the project to happen? Is the cost reasonable? Those two things kind of go together, But thinking about is the cost reasonable, one example that Charlotte always gives is, you don't need 18 hammers to do the project, but maybe you need a couple. It's, for example, it's something like that. That's what we mean by reasonable. And is the cost verifiable? Really importantly, do you have proof of this expense, like an invoice, a donor statement, examples like that, the salary spreadsheet for your staff member or for volunteer time. We need to have that proof of the match, and it's really important, to share that for the in-kind especially. So I know this was a bit short and sweet compared to some of our other webinars, but if you have any questions, we would love for you to put them in the chat or in the Q&A section. We can help answer those, kind of as we go. I did want to provide my email address here. If you have any questions about Match, any questions about specifically, any questions about the Historic Preservation Capital Grant Program specifically, please reach out to me. Also, again, here are the websites that I kept referring to where you'll be able to find the grant guidelines. You'll be able to find the spreadsheet and other documents that you're going to need to fill out the application. And the AAHPP grant website is also here. So come April, if you want to apply to that program, you have the website there, and you'll know that the match requirements are really pretty similar to both of those programs and know where to find all that information.